If your family is anything like mine, part of what you do when you get together around things like the holidays is share some family stories. Because every family has them. We all have our family history, and some parts of that history turn into family folklore, the family legends. There's always those good old favorite family stories, the ones that everyone around could tell. They could tell it by heart. And whenever there's a new significant other around or a new friend that comes, you have to tell those stories. So they're good stories, but then there's those other kind of stories. The family stories that your dad or your cousin would never normally say out loud because they have a filter of what's appropriate and what's not. But thanks to loosening up in some wine or eggnog, that filter has gone far away and those stories come out, those other kind of stories. The ones that push everyone's buttons. You know the stories I'm talking about? The ones that threaten to break the peace within the people that are gathered there. The hot button issues, and the stories that are a little too vulgar, too embarrassing, too depressing. And when I hear someone start to tell one of these stories, I shake my head, my face goes a little hot and red out of embarrassment of what's to come, and I wonder to myself, why this story? Out of all the parts of our family history, why do you have to share this particular story right now? And it's the same question that I wonder about our gospel reading this morning. Why this story right here and now? Because it's still Christmas time. We're celebrating Christmas in the church, and even outside of the church, this is still a generally cheerful time of the year. So why is it that we come here Sunday morning and we hear the story of a king who sends soldiers to slaughter a town full of innocent children? What about all that joy and hope and peace and love of Christmas? Instead, we're talking about a story of evil and death. But what I've come to realize is that all of our history matters. All of our stories matter because they all shape us. They all are a part of who we are, even those stories we would rather not talk about. They all shape us. And this story today, this gospel reading, actually has a lot to do with our world, I think. Because death and evil, they're a part of the Christmas story, and they're certainly a part of our world. We all face death. We all know the horrible and evil things that human beings can do to one another. But it's within that evil, it's in that darkness, in those terrible stories of death, that God comes in the picture. Just when we think that it's only greed and selfishness and violence, that's the way of the world, there's nothing we can do about it, God comes to show us another way. God's way, choosing love and compassion no matter what. God's way that shows the value of the humanity of all people. And when God came in the flesh, in the person of Jesus, God came to lead us down that path. The path that shows us life coming out of the dust. So we tell these stories of evil and death in the Bible and our world, knowing that they're part of the larger story of God's redemption. When we lived in Texas, we were in the Dallas area. So, of course, we went to see, since it was a new part of the country for us, went to do some sightseeing and some exploring of the things around there. And one of the things that we went to do in Texas was see the George W. Bush Presidential Library. If you don't know about presidential libraries, they're not where ex-presidents go to read books. They're like museums, basically. And they show that portion of history through that president's term of office. It was actually really fascinating to go and look at those 8 years, 2000 to 2008, through that particular lens. And as you might imagine, there was a large part of that museum that was devoted to the attacks on September 11th, 2001. It's hard to believe that it was more than 17 years ago that that tragic morning happened. Many of us can remember exactly where we were and what we were doing on that morning. In that part of the museum, there was a young boy that we overheard talking with his parents as he was looking around at the different video clips and the pictures. And he was looking at one particular image of a mother who was crying and holding her child, and he asked his parents, "Where's the daddy?" And they said, "Well, the daddy died." He said, "Why would someone kill daddies? Why would someone kill daddies?" It breaks your heart. The things that we can do to one another, the things that human beings are capable of, the evil that we can do. I remember watching an interview about 9/11. It was in this documentary. And the interviewer was asking the question, is evil an appropriate word to use? Talking about the attackers, talking about the terrorists involved. And it was actually Vladimir Putin who answered, not someone who I would normally quote, but he had an interesting take on this question of evil. He said, evil is really mild language for what happened, because they looked at us and saw nothing but dust. To them, we were nothing but dust. And especially if you remember those news footages of New York City as the towers fell and the city was full of dust, that phrase takes on a whole another layer of meaning. They saw us as nothing but dust. I think it's a helpful way to understand evil. In Genesis, it says that God formed the first human beings, made us out of dust, out of the dirt and earth and soil, and then God breathed life into us, put that spirit, the breath of life in us, and we were made in the image of God. God breathed life into the dust of our bodies. Evil happens when we fail to acknowledge that we are all fellow children of God, when we don't see the humanity in one another and we only see the flesh, only the dust. We dehumanize one another. And that process of dehumanization, it works both ways, because you can't dehumanize someone else without losing a part of your own humanity. It happens all the time in our world. It happened at 9/11, and it happened with King Herod. Herod the Great was given some authority by the Romans to rule over that area, and we don't have any other historical evidence of that slaughter of the innocents outside of the Bible, but it fits with the other historical accounts we do have about Herod. For instance, we have some historical accounts that show us that Herod the Great murdered 3 of his sons and 1 of his wives because he was always paranoid about losing his power, especially to those potential heirs. And so he murdered some of them. There's another account of how Herod, when he was nearing the end of his life, gave this order to some of his top officials that on the day that he died, he gave them this list of well-liked, important people throughout the land. And so when he died, they were supposed to go out and execute all of the people on that list, so that when he died, there would be more people mourning and wailing over his death. Now, fortunately, no one remained loyal or heartless enough to Herod after he died to complete that order, but that fits with what we find in our story. It makes sense. It's not surprising that if Herod heard about this rival king, he would do whatever he could to snuff that rival out. Because when you see your fellow human beings not as children of God, but as nothing but dust, well, then killing a town full of innocent children becomes a viable option to secure your power. But then I wonder about the soldiers. I know there are issues of the chain of command and following orders, but really, killing all of the children 2 and younger in an entire town, I feel like that boy in the museum. Why would someone kill the children? We never heard what the boy's parents told him, but it got me wondering, first of all, what would I have said? How would you explain human acts of evil to a young child? But then it also got me wondering, what would Jesus have heard? At some point, Mary and Joseph must have told him about their journey to Egypt and all the violence, especially considering that it was all really because of him that it happened. What did they tell him? Since we believe Jesus is God, we get this mistaken impression sometimes that Jesus came out of the womb fully formed, all-knowing, understanding everything. But we believe Jesus was also a real human being, which means he had to learn and grow. He was formed in part by his surroundings, by what his parents taught him, how they answered his questions in the stories that they told him. And whatever they told him, he ended up understanding the way God works in the world, because Jesus certainly knew about evil. We talked last Sunday about the rebellion that happened when Jesus was just a few years old, and the Romans came in and burned the city of Sepphoris just a few miles away from where Jesus grew up. So Jesus knew well the evil that the empire could do, just like he knew about the evil of King Herod and his soldiers. And yet Jesus never sought retribution. Jesus never taught us to answer violence with violence, fight evil with evil. When you think about Jesus telling the crowd of people to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, think about the implications. You know those soldiers who slaughtered all the children in the town of Bethlehem? Love them. You know the king who ordered it? Pray for people like him too. That's a lot more difficult than being nice to difficult people, which is how we sometimes view that. The people at that time, they knew real enemies, people who saw them as nothing but dust, and were willing to do unspeakable evil acts to them. And Jesus says, love and pray and forgive. And then when he was on the cross, dying one of the worst deaths that you could die, he didn't say, Father, smite those people because they're bad news. We might think that in that situation, but Jesus said, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. They've lost track of his humanity and therefore their own humanity. They're no longer seeing the value and beauty that's inherent in all human life, and Jesus refuses to do the same thing. In that act of forgiveness, he tells them, even now that you are killing me, even now that you are doing unspeakable evil, you are still a child of God. You are still able to be loved and prayed for. So in the face of evil, God restores our humanity, shows us that life can come out of the dust. But for us, it is extremely hard to see past the dust sometimes. It's hard to see beyond the dust when soldiers and a king murder a town full of innocent children. It's hard to see beyond the dust, to see the humanity of terrorists who kill thousands of innocent people. It's hard to see beyond the dust of lone gunmen who terrorize our country and corrupt governments around the world who turn on their own people. It's hard to see them as human beings beyond the dust. But our tendency to dehumanize one another happens in more subtle ways too. There was this one particular excerpt from one of the talk shows that Stephen Colbert did, the late-night comedian, on the night of the election of 2016, that presidential election, after the results came in, and they were uncharacteristically serious remarks. Colbert talked about how this political environment has become so divisive, especially in that most recent presidential election cycle. There were some polls that show that many Republicans and Democrats don't just disagree with one another, they actually fear people on the other side, hate people on the other side. And he described this divisiveness in our climate as a kind of poison. And this is what he said about it. You take a little bit of this poison so you can hate the other side, and it tastes kind of good, and you like how it feels. And there's a gentle high to the condemnation, and you know you're right. You see, the temptation of looking at stories of evil like 9/11 and Herod the Great is to come to the conclusion that dehumanizing one another is okay as long as we're on the right side, as long as we're not with the monsters, as long as we're right in the important issues of today. Because some people, they're just too evil. We don't have to see them as human beings and try to understand them. Just like some people's ideas are so out of touch with the reality, so different from our own ideas that must be right, that we can write them off. We can fear and hate them and not listen to them. And in subtle or not so subtle ways, we stop valuing one another. We stop seeing the humanity in our fellow children of God. And that may feel good sometimes, that self-righteous feeling, knowing you're right, but it's still a poison that we drink. It doesn't just hurt the other side, it hurts us too. For Jesus to forgive, to show value in the lives even of the people that crucified him, he must have learned about that poison and decided he was never going to drink it. But more than that, Jesus doesn't just reject that poison of hate and apathy. Jesus actually gives us an antidote. Because just as we lose our humanity when we dehumanize one another, Our humanity is restored when we show God's love to one another, especially the most unlovable of our brothers and sisters in this world. We realize the truth, that it's not us versus them, it's only us with Him. And when we lose track of our humanity, Jesus shows us the path to value the beauty of life in all human beings. This side of heaven will never know what Mary and Joseph would have told Jesus about Herod and their trip to Egypt. But however they told that story, Jesus knew what happens when we lose track of our common humanity and when we see each other not as human beings, but as nothing but flesh and dust. But they must have told Jesus that God saved them. God led them in the path that leads to life. I'm sure they told Jesus about the angels that came declaring He would bring peace and good news to all people. So the story that Jesus heard was one of evil, but one of evil that led to life coming out of the dust. May we know that story in our world, in our lives. And may God lead us down that path that sees the value and beauty of all human beings, the path that brings life out of the evil, darkness, and dust of our world. Amen.